Hello, and welcome to today's ACM SIGSOFT webinar. This webcast is part of ACM SIGSOFT's commitment to provide value to its current and future members. The ACM SIGSOFT webinar series features speakers from the Future of Software Engineering track at the International Conference of Software Engineering, as well as select keynote speakers and distinguished paper authors. I am Pekka Abrahamsson, Professor of Software Engineering at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. First, the slides will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you will find a number of additional widgets and resources. Now, if you're experiencing problems with slides or audio, press F5 key in Windows, Command+R on a Mac, or refresh your browser or mobile devices. Or you can close and relaunch the presentation. To control volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. If you have any questions during this webinar, please type them into the Q&A box at any time during the webinar and click the submit button. At the end of the presentation, we will have time to respond to the questions. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You will receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available. Today's presentation is Essence in Action by Ivar Jacobson and Brian Kerr. Ivar Jacobson received his PhD in computer science from KTH Royal Institute of Technology. Ivar is a father of components and component architecture, work that was adopted by Ericsson and resulted in the greatest commercial success story ever in the history of Sweden. He is the father of use cases and objectory, which after the acquisition of Rational Software in 1995 resulted in a Rational Unified Process, a widely adopted method. He is also one of the 3 original developers of the Unified Modeling Language. But all this is history. Ivar founded his current company, Ivar Jacobson International, which since 2004 has been focused on using methods and tools in a smart and agile way. This work resulted in that Ivar became a founder and a leader of a worldwide network, CMAT, which has the mission to revolutionize software development based on a kernel of software engineering. The kernel has been realized as a formal OMG standard called Essence. Brian Kerr is an experienced agile coach, consultant, trainer, and a change agent. He has spent the last 25 years in the software and IT consulting industry and is one of the founders of IGI in the UK. Brian has been involved with the early ideas of the industry standard Essence since its inception and is currently working on the future tooling that will bring Essence practices to life. And I have personally known Ivar more than a decade. I've actively supported the CMAT initiative since its first days. It is truly an honor to be here together with Ivar and Brian. Ivar and Brian, without further ado, take it away.
Hello, everybody. It's a great honor to be here and speak about the work that we have done for many years by now. Essence in Action is the title of the talk today. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, we presented the key ideas, and we also presented on a more theoretical way what Essence is and its value. Now today we are going to talk about real usage of Essence in terms of how teams work, and we will do that by play games. I'll start by repeat a little of what we did talked about last time. And then we will show what practice look like in Essence, We play a number of games. That will be Brian that do this game playing. And at the end, we'll talk about Essence, using Essence as a thinking framework. The Essence is what we call the standard common ground. For the first time in the 60-plus year history of software engineering, we got a common ground. In the past, we have developed methods, and every method starts all over from defining concepts. What is a method? What is an activity? What is etc., etc. And the method owner invents his own way of presenting it, and some of them are good, some of them are huge, like what we did with Rational Unified Process. We learned the lesson, and we found out that we need to do something that is more based on common ground, that everybody can say yes to. It has two aspects, and that is in a way new compared to methods in the past. And the technical aspect is about guiding with a modern user experience. We use poker-sized cards, guiding people to do a particular piece of work. It focuses on what is essential instead of trying to take the whole thing. Most method books are more than about the essentials. And if people understand the essentials, they can really participate in real work, even if they are no experts, and then they learn as they go. So, and the technical part has two components, the language and the kernel, which I will say a few words about next. More important, no, I shouldn't say more important, but coming from the agile world is primarily the social engineering aspect. We have some technical practices in the agile world, but we have many human-related practices. So Essence is also a thinking framework, stimulating conversations about important subjects within a team and between teams. It has numerous placeholders for conversations, with proposals for questions to be asked and space for asking more questions. And finally, software development becomes a set of serious interactive games. These are, in a way, what the core things we have learned from Agile. Of course, there are many Agile practices being developed on top of Essence today. So, what is Essence from a technical point? It's two things. It is a language which is visual, simple, intuitive. You learn it in just an hour or two. Using it is takes a little bit more time, but to learn it and understand it is quite an easy thing. And then the kernel. The kernel is like the basics, the fundamental that we always deal with. The essential things to work with, the essential things to do, the essential competences you need. You can compare this with in software, you have operating system. Essence is like the operating system for methods. Without practices, without applications on top of the operating system, it's not very useful. The same thing without practice on top of a kernel, it's not very useful. The language is very simple, at least the most important thing. The practice has a notation of a hexagon. Then to describe it, you describe what activities are performed to be suggested to be done. And the activities progress what we call alphas. Alphas is a new concept. It represents elements to progress. We will show you example of alphas. Alphas are not work products, but work products describe alphas. For instance, if you talk about requirements is not can be described or not described, but they still exist. What you need to develop. The important things about these alphas are that they have states, and you can measure progress of an alpha. So, for instance, at the beginning, requirements are just conceived. Later, you have bounded them, meaning you have put the border around what should be designed and what is outside the system. So that is state progression. Activities require competences. So there are competences in the kernel. And finally, we have what we call patterns, which are generic mechanisms for describing other elements and their relationship. So, for instance, a role is a pattern which has competences of different levels. Competence can be on low level and high level. So that is described by pattern, for instance. We use cards as placeholders for conversations. Many teams use tokens to represent their work, but they can also use this approach to represent how they work, learning, collaborating, etc. So here is a team working on the board. This is a very practical way of working. People feel participating in the work, and that is a way that Essence support in many different ways. Let's now look at a particular example. Scrum is probably one of the most adopted practices ever developed. Millions of people have got trained. And this is the way Jeff Sutherland describes how Scrum works. We have worked with Jeff Sutherland to develop, essentialize Scrum and come up with a set of cards that represent Scrum. On the cards, we have every card works as a placeholder for conversation. We have cards representing principles, and they are designed using the pattern construct. And we have, I will not go through them now, we will touch them later. We have cards for roles, and these are the famous Scrum roles. We have activities, things to do, and they are all represented on the card that help us to, in the team, have a good conversation of what it means to do a particular activity. Then we have things to work with, and there are two kinds of things to work with. We have the alphas, sprint, product backlog item. For instance, product backlog item goes through 3 states before during its life cycle, from identified, ready, and done. We have also work products that are evidence of an alpha, and there are 5 of them. So with these words, I want to leave over to Brian to talk about some key games that have been developed using the Scrum Essentials.
Okay, thank you, Ivar. So I'll use Scrum as an example practice that many of you are probably familiar with, but the games I'm going to show you apply to any practice or indeed combinations of practices. When people get cards with the key concepts in their hands, they can't help but group them together, see how they relate to each other, and start to use them to facilitate conversations. The first game I'd like to show you is one called Practice Mapping, and uses the cards for learning about a practice. It's like a concept map that allows you to explore how the various concepts of a practice relate to each other, and is a good way to show and see how people understand things. This particular photo shows one partial practice map in progress, focusing around one area, the product backlog, with a team arranging the cards and they're drawing the relationships, in this case on flip chart paper. Here we can see the team roles grouped together at the top, how they relate to some of the activities and the things produced. It looks quite simple. It's a bit like a class diagram in one sense. And there's many clues on the cards themselves that actually tell you what these relationships are. But it's actually quite deceptively hard to give good names to these relationships, even if you are familiar with the subject area. It makes you think and gets to the real deeper workings of the overall practice. There's no ultimate right answer to this kind of diagram, but it does reveal how people think and will quickly show any misunderstandings or big gaps in knowledge. So let's look at some examples of how people might have some of these misunderstandings and how we can actually use that in a training environment. So here's some examples that we've just drawn up that we've seen. And most of them on the surface look quite good. Here we can see a Scrum Master facilitating a daily Scrum, and the development team is involved. And the team here have just added some words in to say the Scrum Master facilitates and the development team attend, coordinate the work and raise impediments. So that kind of looks good on the surface, but it might then pose some questions when we're trying to teach people something. So for instance, we might ask, well, does it really need the Scrum Master to facilitate? What if they're not available? Is this the only place where the team raises impediments? So it's quite a good way to see how people view how this practice works together. Another example would be product backlog items. This fragment of the diagram is showing that the product owner is accepting some of the product backlog items during the sprint review. So we might pose the question there, well, do we really want to do that at the very end of the sprint review, or might we want to do that a little bit more just when the product backlogs items are ready? Final example might be one where the product owner's creating the product backlog items during product backlog refinement. So that looks good on the surface, but we might then ask the question, well, who's involved in that? Shouldn't the team get involved in helping with it? So just by drawing these diagrams, it allows us to see what other people are thinking and then kind of ask them questions. We find the cards are very useful in teaching and coaching these practice. They focus people on the essentials, and they give useful reminders of the most important things. And we can use them in a number of ways. We could use them at the start of some training to introduce some of the key words and sort of gauge the existing knowledge of the people in the audience. We can use it during a training course or some coaching session to see how a new idea might fit in with existing knowledge or existing ideas that we've talked about previously. You could also use it at the end of a training course or a coaching session just to see how much people have understood, and if there are any misunderstandings, deal with those misunderstandings. We found this works really good in small groups because it gets the discussion going and people can start to kind of help each other in terms of understanding how the things fit together. We have worked with Jeff Sutherland for quite a while on this Essence approach, and he uses these cards in his own training. So here's a quote from Jeff where he's found that people have often been looking for a tool that helps accelerate their learning and the application of Scrum, and he's found that these Essence cards are a good way to do that. We had quite a good chat with Jeff just before Christmas, and some of the other games that we're about to show you are ones that he's now looking at incorporating into his training as we go forwards. So I'm going to show you a few more games now. That was a very simple one, which really didn't have much of a board or much guidance. It was just a clean sheet of paper, getting some ideas down. This one that we're going to look at is called Practice Patience, and it's kind of a retrospective. This photo is from a recent customer where the team is having a good discussion about their application of Scrum by grouping and categorizing the different parts of the practices. But the board itself provides a kind of thinking framework and guides the conversation. It's got some structure to it. And with the cards in their hands, what we find is everybody gets involved and uses them to quickly make group decisions. And this happens much quicker than if we were just talking about things with words. People can misunderstand things, but with the cards, we find actually people can, as a group, make these decisions. So we can quickly end up with a final view of, in a retrospective, where we think we are with a particular practice, which things we're good at, which things we're bad at. Now, to help us understand the rules of this game, I've recreated that board here so we can actually see some of the details and I can explain how that game operates. So this is the same one here. We place our cards up and down the board. We can say how important it is to the team, the relative importance. So if something's very important, and we'd hope most of the Scrum things, which are kind of a core practice, should be very important. But if a team decides that certain elements are not relevant, well, that's probably a good place to have a discussion then and understand why. If we move the cards left and right, we can see on this board we've got some columns, and that's really why we call it patience. We're putting things into these groupings and columns. And on the left, we can see if we're good at it, if we're okay at it, or we're really interested in the ones on the right-hand side, which says, well, these items, we recognise that we're not particularly good at that, and perhaps we should do something to improve it. The column on the right-hand side, called improvement actions, well, that's just a good reminder then to make sure that people don't forget to identify improvement actions and plan them in, so that then they make the improvement and it doesn't come up again in the next retrospective. We're actually making improvements as we go along. So let's have a look at some examples of what might happen here. So some typical findings are, we might find a bunch of stuff that we think we're good at. So here we've got a number of roles and activities, but as we go through, we can capture more information. So on post-its, on top of these cards, this is like the table in front of us, we can start to capture something like, we think we're good at sprint planning, but some of the inputs are quite poor. So perhaps we need to do something here, not about the way we do sprint planning, but perhaps our inputs, our requirements, we might need to get better at. Here we see that they've identified a few more roles and activities that they think they're okay with, but they might put some comments in. So improvement, they say they're okay at it, but we don't check if we've been successful. So they're doing things, they're making those improvements, but really they should go back and check, see if that improvement action that they made actually had the right expected output. The ones we really want to concentrate though on are the ones that we're having problems with. So often these are the ones that people identify first. So you can see they've put a few in here, some are less important than others, but on the top right it's the product owner that they see, that role, and they can add some comments in here as well. So the comments they're saying are things like the product owner, we need clarity on the role. So perhaps we've got somebody that's been assigned that role but is slightly unsure about what it means. So we need clarity on the role and how they're going to work with stakeholders. And they've got some other comments to do with some of the activities. So that's a good way to get some of the information. And if you're doing this with a group, people are kind of doing this all simultaneously. And you don't often have to discuss every single item as it comes up. The group can just move the cards around and you can get to a quick conclusion very soon. The most important thing coming out, though, is this column down the right-hand side, which is the improvement actions. So if we see one example of what we put in at the top, well, the top right, we have the product owner. So the improvement action was the product owner and the rest of the Scrum team. They need to agree what the relative responsibilities are between them, and they might need some more guidance on perhaps managing the stakeholders. So that might be a good case where we could use some of the cards in another game, which we'll see later, to actually help with that. Similarly, they'll come up with some improvement actions for all the other items. Things like scheduling in backlog refinement session, things like that. So what we've seen there is that retrospectives are one of the most important events for a new team, but often they're not performed well. But when we start to use the cards, what we find is instead of just being an open-ended brainstorm, we actually find that Essence, the practice, kind of guides the event and it makes sure that some of the important concepts aren't forgotten. So we move from just that open-ended brainstorm to a team all collaborating and actually being able to make sure that the whole practice is remembered. So doing this for a retrospective, you might not do it every single retrospective, but perhaps once every 4 or 5 retrospectives, you go back to basics and make sure you're doing the core things well. And the brief definitions on the cards, they're completely in keeping with the original Scrum Guide, so they help with any disagreements about interpretations or what the terms mean. So the key thing then is going from just individuals, getting this team discussion going. And here's some quotes we had from this particular team in the photo, where they found the cards good at guiding the questions, making it very obvious the areas they needed to focus on. It helped them find areas that they'd neglected or simply took for granted. And as a team, they found that really this particular game was probably one of the best tools they found to make sure that they kept them kind of honest and evolving and always making sure that they looked for things to improve. So that's quite a good example then of using a board to help that discussion, and what's feeding it is the practices. Now, one of the examples that we saw from that retrospective was they needed to agree with their product owner their relative responsibilities. And one good game to do that is called Contract Bridge. So this is a good game to play, particularly when there's a perceived boundary between a team and its customer or product owner. It could be from another part of the business, or it could even be more of a formal contractual agreement between a customer and a supplier. The particular board here is quite simple. We just draw a line. Typically this is going to be on a table, and we draw a line on, say, a flip chart, and we'll just label those two halves. In this case, we've labelled it business and development. So it's people in the same organisation, but perhaps the product owner here is coming from another part of the business. And perhaps they're not that familiar with what Scrum is and what that role entails. So what we're going to do here is use the practice content. Our example is going to be Scrum. And we'll put in our roles. We'll choose all of the key activities. And we'll also, on the right-hand side here, add any key items that we produce that are important. So here the definition of done is something that we care about getting some agreement on. So how we play the game is we move these cards up and down. If something's completely one side or the other, that means business or development is completely responsible for it. If something's on the line, then it's a joint responsibility. And if we move it more in one direction than the other, it shows who takes the lead. So let's see how that might play out. So if we move the cards into that position, well, we can see that the roles, the product owners played by the business, Scrum Master and development team, they come from the development side of the organisation, and all of the other things are on the line. And that's no surprise for a practice like Scrum, which is a very collaborative way of working. But you can see that some things are being led by the business, some things are being led by the development team, and some things are in the middle, i.e. their joint responsibilities. Now, a good thing to do here is, rather than actually just give somebody the answer, you actually want to work through this with the people involved as a team. We want to add notes in above each of these cards to actually say what the key responsibility is from their particular perspective. So here we can see that the business has got, they own the backlog, they prioritise, they lead, they explain the backlog items, whereas the development team, they're going to arrange that session, participate in it, ensure they understand things, estimate. So it's helping people understand what role they need to play. So that product owner who doesn't particularly understand Scrum perhaps too deeply, as we start to fill this in, they start to realise where they need to participate, what they need to do. We also might capture some information about the role as well, where they are, what time they've got available. And this can form quite a good kind of visible view as how you've agreed to work with each other. And perhaps in a different situation, it could actually form perhaps the beginnings of a contract in terms of how you're going to work with somebody. If we look at that more contractual way of working, what we might find is it's a very similar picture, only some of these cards now are actually below the line. So here we're saying it's more of a customer and a supplier relationship, and some things the customer's got no involvement in, so they're not going to be turning up to, in this case, daily scrums or the retrospectives. So they might describe, as before, some examples of where their relative responsibilities lie, and also where they're available and what locations they're in, etc. And this is a great way to visualize things and make sure that right up front, you actually know what's expected. And so you don't then find any kind of false expectations later on when you're working together and when the customer isn't available, well, okay, we've identified that up front about when they should be available and they're aware of it. So those were some example games that showed using the cards from the practice and some boards almost as thinking frameworks. We saw earlier that really Essence, though, is two things. What we've seen so far is the practices used the language. So we had those cards and we were using them. But we've also got this power of the kernel, which describes some of the essential things that we work with and some of the essential things that we do. So what we can do is actually use that kernel, and that's some of the games that are coming up next. This is a view of the kernel. The things on the right-hand side, these are actually called activity spaces. So they're like activities, but they don't tell you exactly how to do these things. They just show you that these things need to happen. Things like understanding requirements, shaping the system, implementing, testing, deploying, operating. The things that have to happen for every kind of development that we do when we're building systems. And the practices that we've got will come in and tell us how to do these things. But there could be many different practices that different teams use. The cards I've got on the left are the ones that come with Scrum. So if we place these into the activity spaces, we can kind of see what coverage we've got. So let's see what that looks like. So here we can see that Scrum is actually filling up some of these boxes, but actually there's quite a lot of other things that Scrum doesn't talk about. And that's a good thing in a way, because Scrum is just providing the framework. We'll need some other practices to fill in the gaps. So we could use this as a way to work out, well, what other practices do we need? We might find that just by, instead of having Essence practices, just by using like post-it notes, we might identify we've already got some existing ways of working that we can start to say, well, we already know how to do architecture and implementation and testing. We can also use this board as a way to see kind of holistically what we need to do and identify where do we think we can improve. So we might start to identify some risky areas. In this example, we've got some risks where they've identified, well, our requirements were a bit fragmented. We struggle to see the big picture. And in this customer space at the top, where we might kind of explore more the business case and the problem we're trying to solve, we don't really have a systematic way of doing that. So that might prompt us to perhaps go and look for other practices that we could adopt to help us fill those spaces. The kernel also has the most important, kind of the essential things that we produce, those things that Ivar was talking about earlier called alphas. And there's just a few at the top level. There's only 7. So the opportunity, which is kind of the problem that we're trying to solve. Various stakeholders have that opportunity and will fund it, and they really care about the solution. We're going to build some kind of system. So usually we define some requirements to help us understand what we're going to build. And we'll have a team that does that work, and they usually work to a particular style or their own way of working. So these are these top level things that we care about most and we want to track. Now we can use that in a similar way to see, well, what coverage have we got? So those top level items now are, we can see on the board at the top here. And the cards I've got on the left are the ones that come from Scrum. So these were the alphas we saw before, which are the sprint, the product backlog item, and improvement. So we can start to see where those fit in. So Scrum has filled in certain parts of this, but there's other areas of this board that says, well, we still need something to represent the stakeholders, the opportunity, things to do with our team. And we probably need more information in some of these other ones as well. So it gives us a nice holistic view of what we need and where practices need to come together. So this might kind of show us that perhaps we'll look at the requirements area. One of the risks we saw was we were struggling to see the big picture. So what we could do is perhaps look at another practice. Let's introduce a new practice. So what might help us with looking at the big picture of requirements? Well, use cases are quite good at that. They show us a picture. And if you look at a modern practice, like the use case 2.0 practice, we'll see that the use cases actually come with use case slices. And these are very similar to like user stories. These make good product backlog items. And it's got a kind of life cycle. So they go from being scoped to prepared, we analyze them, we implement them, and we verify them. So they make good product backlog items. So if we put these into the picture, we'll see, okay, we're starting to fill up that requirement space. And we could go and find other practices as well to help us identify some of the other gaps. Now, we mentioned some of the states there for the use case slice. And this is the picture that we saw before that Ivar showed, where people often track what they're doing on a board, their actual real work, not necessarily the way they're working. And these backlog items, though, so that use case slice is probably the perfect item to show us the particular item that we want to track and look at its progress. And probably the states that we saw inside that item, those are great column headings for the things that we want on a typical Kanban board. So the essence here in the language is not only helping us understand how we work, it's also tied in very directly to our day-to-day working. And that's quite a special thing where we can start to bring those two things together. Now, looking at state, these items at the top level, they also have state. So I think something like the top level system that we're building starts with things like we choose an architecture, we've got it to a demonstrable state, it's usable, it's ready, it's operational, and maybe one day we might retire it. Similarly with the opportunity, it goes through a number of these particular states, from just identifying the problem at the beginning to finally addressing it and get the benefit accrued. This is very powerful though, because this is giving us some ideas from the Essence kernel that are completely independent of how we're working. It doesn't matter what practices we're using, these top level states stay the same. And that allows us then to play some interesting games. Each state as well, rather than just being a little label, comes with its own checklist. So here we can see that each of the states of the opportunity comes with some checklist items, so that when a group of people look at this, they can compare it with the checklist and see where they are. And the checks here are really got nothing to do with kind of producing documents or things like that. They're really about achieving things. And that means they're quite independent of how you're working. So what you can do then is, as a team, start to look at some of these checklists and say, where are we? So for the opportunity, yeah, we've achieved that. We've identified the opportunity and understood it. Do we need to build a solution? Okay, they've identified a couple of items here, but there's perhaps more to do. We actually played this game with a very sort of large internet search engine provider, which you can probably guess the name of. And the team leader there, when they played this game, their initial thought was all of their problems were around sort of technical risks and technical issues. They played this game and they soon realized that actually, thinking holistically, most of their issues were really around the business problem and the business case and stakeholders and things like this. And Essence can then give you that broad view and make you think way more wider than just focusing in on building and sort of finishing off backlog items. One game that you're probably familiar with in the Agile world is something like planning poker. We can play similar games with the cards here. We could play progress poker, where you give people in a team this set of cards with the checklists on, and between them they can decide then, well, what state do we think they're in? And you often get quite opposing views. If people agree though, just move on. You've got that agreement. Where you've got disagreement, that's where you need to have that discussion and say, well, why do we think we're in different positions? And these kind of kernel games, they're great as well for helping to explain and educate. And at this point, I'll hand back to Ivar, who we can see in this photo down below, kind of using one of these games in a more structured form and using the Essence kernel. So Ivar, back to you.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, that is quite exciting or quite exciting pictures taken in China. Brian was in London and I was in Suzhou. And we had 30 Scrum Masters in the class. They were using Scrum, they were experienced in using Scrum, not always happy with it, but nevertheless, they had that experience. And we gave a similar presentation as we have done now. During the actual presentation, people were quite quiet, and that is typical for China. In China, my experience is that you don't speak if you have your boss in the room. It's his role to speak. And since he usually don't understand, he doesn't speak either. Well, that was a kind of joke. Sorry for that. Anyway, we gave his presentation. They were quite quiet. And afterwards, down to the right, I played the game I'm going to show you now. And everybody was engaged, looking at the cards, discussing with one another. and asked lots of questions. It's really what happens when you play the games. You engage the whole team. So here, one of the games is, we call it, we build a health monitor, but the game is called Chasing the State. We lay out the cards. So to the left, we have the alpha cards, which is the cards that show which states you have for the alpha. To the right, you have one card for each alpha. And it may be difficult to read all this, but, well, it is difficult. You cannot read it, and you don't need to do. But the game is played like this. Inside the team, we start to discuss, and we can take the top row and look at the first card there and ask ourselves, where are we? So here we have the stakeholders. Have we reached the state recognized? And there are 3 different checks you have to do to get to that state. And if you say yes to them, you have reached that state, and you move a card to the left. Then you take the next card and do similar things, look at it, and yes, 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 yes. So you move that card. And then you look at the third one, and here you say, well, no, no, no. So the card will stay where it is, and instead you move to the next row and do the same thing. In this way, you go over row after row and agree on where you are. The interesting thing is that you can hear, if you are a more experienced person coming in and looking at what the team is doing, you can see if the team make moves that are balanced. For instance, some teams may spend too much time on requirements and not do anything on the software system. And that is easy to discover. You have required something that never may be realized. So it's not a good balance. You can also use this now to decide what to do next. So you basically go to the right and look at card after card and decide whether you're going to do that in the next sprint, for instance. So it's very useful, very engaging in the team. You can use it also if a team meets a project manager, responsible for many teams, because it's completely agnostic to how you do it. You can use different methods, but you can still use the same game to find out where you are. So these checklists are very popular, not only in our space, but it's used in surgery, where the doctor has 3 states. So first, before I cannot really read it, but it's basically before anesthetics. And there are a number of things you have to answer. All are very simple questions, like, do you know the name, and so on. Next state is before skin incision, and finally, before patient leaves the operating room. Such checklists have saved life. It has reduced the deaths by almost 50% or something around 50%, which is, of course, very important. And it's also very simple. We also use it for another thing, namely lifecycle. Most methods are described with a particular lifecycle. Not necessarily in Agile, where we basically take one sprint at a time, but even there you have some need for decisions. So for each decision point or phase in your lifecycle, you create a column. Decision to fund, decision to go live, and decision to hand over. Then for each alpha, you create a row. So you have here you have the alphas to the left, and then you play all the cards for each alpha. So you may say that to decision to fund, you have to reach state 4 for stake opportunity. And the same thing for stakeholder, you have to reach state 3, and to your decision to go live, you have to reach state 4 for stakeholder, and so on. So we get a very precise way of specifying what is the end of a phase or a decision point, and based on these cards. Useful for discussions. I mean, the cards are not the final answer, but they help you to stimulate discussions in the team or between different roles in the organization. Normally, these things are delivered with the method. They are locked into the method. A lifecycle layout is described as a practice where these things are patterns. The pattern is what does it mean to have a decision to fund? Namely, these cards have to be in these states. These alphas have to be in these states. Okay. So Essence is used in many different contexts. This is in Japan. We had 120 executives. Well, it was not executive, but in a company with 40,000 consultants, 120 top people met and played. Sorry for that. Played 6 games based on Essence. We didn't talk about that it is Essence. Essence was something we mentioned at the end. The company in question made a blog. They call this a triumph for Essence. So I think we basically have finished the presentation, but I will tell you a little about where you can find out more. On our website, down on the bottom of this page, you can find many games that you can play with Scrum, and they are, well, I think there are 6 of them, and you will see the value of game playing. There are many, many more games that can be played, but we have not published them yet. You can find more information here about the games and in Essence in general. And this is the end of it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ivar and Brian. Now there are many questions that come. Let me start with the one that came to mind, is that what is the learning curve and how long does it take for a team to make good use of the cards? And any of you, either one you can answer.
Yeah, what we find with the cards is often if we're playing some of the games like the Retrospective and people are familiar with that practice beforehand, there's almost like no learning time. You kind of just show people at the beginning as you facilitate the game and just play it. It's quite easy to do. There's a little bit more deeper understanding though when you start to look at the content of the cards, and if people get to the point where they have to start to capture their own practices, that generally takes a little bit of training beforehand before they can actually create their own. Luckily, most people are more using practices, and that's much easier to do. To get across some of the ideas of the kernel that we saw, usually that's quite a brief thing to do as well, and we can often do that almost in real time as we're doing one of those health checks, explain the fact that we've got these key things that we're with checking the states on with the checklists. So I think we often find that people just learn as they start to use it rather than separate training.
Thanks. And there's a question from Thomas regarding the health check. How frequently would a team use the health check? It seems like some of the alphas would reset every sprint, like requirements. You have a new sprint backlog with new requirements satisfy. Would it be acceptable to decide not to health check certain alphas every single time?
Yeah, I think what you find is that the different alphas are going to move at different paces. So exactly, it's a good question from Thomas. Some of them are going to go very quickly. So those product backlog items, they're going to go through their life cycle, within their sprint. Within a couple of weeks, it's going to get done. Hopefully, within a couple of days, it will get done and go through its life cycle. Some of those top-level ones, though, might take many weeks or many months to actually move. So something like that top-level requirements one, well, that's actually representing perhaps all of the requirements for a particular big release of a system. And that might actually take many months to actually move through its states. Things like the system going from, just being a demonstrable state to actually one that you can put out live operational. Well, that might take several months, or it might actually be very quick. It depends on the case. So it's a great question. Things move at different paces. And it's a bit like small wheels, small cogs inside bigger cogs. Lots of small changes are happening. And when enough of those have happened, generally the alpha that's sitting above them, it will move a state. And perhaps when it moves a state, perhaps there's another one above it, that it will move its state. So it's kind of a bit of a
you could add to that.
Movement.
You could add to that you also have can see how you progress these sub-alphas. So you don't need to just look at the big picture with all the kernel alphas, but actually every practice allow you to introduce new alphas, and then you can instantiate them. For instance, if you do use cases, you will create an alpha instance for each use case and for each use case slice. And then you can see the progress of each. So you can actually follow these all the way down to any detail you really want to monitor.
All right, there's a question from Robert. Is part of a goal of this to train developers to think about business side of operations while at the same time maintaining their roles as developers? Could this eliminate the need for management-only roles?
I think the role of the Essence kernel itself that gives us that holistic view, it's kind of one that would make kind of the whole team be aware that they need to consider these things. And the whole team might include developers, but other people as well. And it's good that everybody is aware of this and can see and have some input into where they are in terms of those top level items. Doesn't necessarily mean we get rid of those management roles. We just need to make sure that somebody is addressing, looking after the progression of those items. And whatever practices that we use for that, it depends who's going to do it. Usually we've got cross-functional teams, and as long as we've got that represented, that's good.
Wait a second, Pekka. Since we have opportunity and stakeholder in the kernel, people are things that people usually miss. They forget about caring about stakeholders. They may think they have stakeholders involved, but they are not really actively involved. And the same thing when it comes to opportunity, basically has to be described as or not necessarily described, but at least known as a business case. So in a way, get back to the question, yes, I think people become more aware of the reason we do it, and don't forget the original reason when they actually do the development, and make sure that the stakeholders are happy with what is being built.
All right, thanks. There's a question from Larry regarding co-location. The photos all seem to show geographically co-located teams. Do you have any guidelines for geographically dispersed teams?
Yeah, I answered that question. So I've actually answered the question in. Can you
answer to everyone or?
No, I answered that question. I've answered a couple of questions on the way. Not all.
Do you want to describe your answer, Ivar?
So I said collocation or not is not included in Essence. Since Essence is a common ground, you have to specify how to do it in a practice designed on top of the Essence kernel.
Yeah, okay. And some of the photos that we saw was actually to do with the game playing rather than the content of the Essence practices. And I think the question might be thinking about that as well. And certainly you can play those games remotely if you want. But the examples we showed were people physically doing things with cards. But as you've seen with real Scrum teams and their Scrum boards, people use electronic whiteboards to do that kind of communication or some other tooling that allows them to share that knowledge. So some of the usage of Essence can be as distributed as we want.
This question from Robert, what metrics do you have about teams adopting Essence versus prior experience in terms of quality, productivity, schedule, etc., standard project management aspects? Does using Essence improve those, and if so, how much?
Do you want me to answer, Brian?
Yeah. I think you might have some good numbers, perhaps from even students and universities and experiments like that.
Yeah, we have, as you understand, first of all, Essence has only been around as a formal standard since a couple of years. And as I said, it's not really useful unless you have a lot of practices defined on top of it. But clearly, so we don't have the numbers that we can provide you with. We have some numbers. For instance, there are a couple of universities that have written reports about how different it is to learn software engineering using a common ground compared to the old way we did it by presenting one method or a few methods as they were described by the method author. And these are very positive results. When it comes to Essence as such, the objective and very explicit objective in the work on Essence have been to improve. We have talked about better, faster, cheaper, and happier. Happier developers, happier clients, but also about value creation. So value is that every practice should provide a value, increased value to the user. So we hope to get more on this point, of course, but and it's a very important point that we are looking for.
Thank you, Ivar. I'm afraid we have run out of time today. I'd like to thank Ivar and Brian again for the informative presentation and insightful answers to the many questions. Special thanks to each of you for taking the time to attend and participate in today's webinar. This webinar was recorded and will be made available online in a few days in the SIGSOFT website. You can find announcements on upcoming ATM and SIGSOFT webinars and other ATM activities at learning.atm.org and www.sigsoft.org. On behalf of the SIGSOFT, the speakers and myself, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you will join again in the future. This concludes today's webinar.
Pekka, don't forget to mention the 24th of January, we will have a new seminar on Essence.
Thank you for reminding about that. In 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, you're very welcome, all of you. And tell everybody how fantastic it is. Or tell me what problems you have.